Part 1. The Shattered Blueprint. The city of Chicago spread out below the 42nd floor of the Omnicorp Tower like a living blueprint, a vast and intricate design of steel, glass, and ambition. From her corner office, Fidelia could trace the arteries of its expressways, the rigid geometry of its grid, the way Lake Michigan pressed against its edge, a vast, indifferent blue. The air in the firm of Vance Fidelia Architects smelled of strong, dark roast coffee and the crisp, clean scent of plotter paper. It was the smell of victory. Fidelia, at 29, was the master of this universe. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, a silhouette of sharp angles and impeccable tailoring against the skyline she was about to permanently alter. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe chignon, not a single strand out of place. Her gaze was as sharp and analytical as the computer-aided designs that filled the screens around her. Blueprints lay unfurled across a vast central table like sacred scrolls, weighted down at the corners with scale models of previous triumphs. Awards gleamed from recessed shelves, polished monuments to a brilliance that felt less like a gift and more like a tool she had forged herself. Behind her, Elias Vance, her fiancé, and the other half of the firm's name, was pouring champagne. The pop of the cork was a punctuation mark on their latest, greatest achievement. "To the Vance Fidelia Tower," he said, his voice smooth and confident. He handed her a flute, his smile as bright and captivating as his portfolio. He was the charismatic frontman, the weaver of narratives that sold their vision to cautious investors. Fidelia was the genius behind the vision, the one who made the impossible math work. They were a power couple, a perfectly balanced equation of charm and intellect. "It's more than a name on a building." "Eli," she said, her eyes still fixed on the city. She took a sip of the champagne, the bubbles fizzing on her tongue, a pale imitation of the effervescent triumph coursing through her veins. "It's a legacy." They had just won the bid. The Vance Fidelia Tower would be a marvel of engineering and aesthetics, a residential skyscraper that seemed to twist toward the sky, its crystalline facade designed to capture and refract the light in 1,000 different ways throughout the day. It was her masterpiece. Every line, every calculation, every material choice was hers. "A legacy built on your back," Elias said, coming to stand beside her, his arm circling her waist. "And my dazzling smile, of course." She allowed herself a small, rare smile. Of course, her focus, however, was already drifting back to the project. Later that afternoon, during a final review of the foundational phase, a junior engineer named Marcus had raised a flag. He was young, nervous, and his concerns were buried in deferential language. "Miss Fidelia?" he had stammered, pointing to a section of the schematics. "The GC7 fast cure concrete mixture? The data is still preliminary. The European studies show incredible compressive strength, but there's not much long-term field testing on its sheer stress tolerance in a multi-pore foundation of this scale. The traditional mix is proven. It just adds 3 weeks to the cure time." Fidelia had looked at him, not with contempt, but with the cool, dispassionate gaze of a mathematician looking at a flawed equation. 3 weeks, Marcus, is an eternity in a project of this budget. It's a cascading delay that will cost our investors 7 figures. I have personally run the stress simulations. I've modeled for seismic anomalies we don't even have in Illinois. I've accounted for a 100-year flood. The calculations are flawless. The GC7 will hold. She tapped the blueprint with a perfectly manicured finger. "The schedule is paramount." Marcus had wilted under her certainty, nodding and retreating back to his cubicle. She hadn't thought of it again until now. It was a minor annoyance, a gnat of doubt she had swatted away with the hand of her own infallible intellect. She was Fidelia. She did not make mistakes. Elias clinked his glass against hers. "What are you thinking about? You're a million miles away." She turned from the window, her focus returning to him, to the moment. She looked past his shoulder at the model of their tower, a miniature deity on its pedestal. "I'm thinking," she said, her voice low and certain, "that we're not just building a skyscraper. Eli, we're building a monument to what's possible. To us." He grinned, pulling her closer. "I'll drink to that." As she looked out at the city again, she didn't see the millions of lives teeming below, the intricate dance of humanity. She saw a canvas, and she, with her will and her mind, was the artist. She was the master of her own universe, the architect of her own fate. God, if he existed at all, was a clumsy draftsman whose work she was here to improve upon. The construction site was a world away from the sterile perfection of her office. Here, the universe was one of chaos and raw power. The air was thick with the scent of wet concrete, diesel fumes, and the metallic tang of welding. The ground vibrated with the roar of heavy machinery, and the shouts of men in hard hats were swallowed by the symphony of industry. Weeks had passed. The foundational pour was in its most crucial phase. Fidelia stood on a temporary observation platform, her own white hard hat a beacon of authority amidst the sea of yellow ones. She was impatient. The process felt sluggish, archaic. Men were ants, and the colossal machines were beasts of burden, all moving too slowly for her mind, which had already completed the structure and was furnishing the penthouse. She tapped her foot, her gaze sweeping across the vast concrete pit, a latticework of rebar and conduits. This was where the GC7 mixture, her controversial choice, was setting. It was the bedrock of her legacy. Then came the sound. It wasn't loud at first, more a vibration felt in the bones than a noise heard by the ear. It was a deep, resonant groan, like a giant waking from a slumber. The ground shuddered, a violent, sickening lurch. Heads snapped up. The roar of machinery died, replaced by a sudden, terrifying silence. The groan intensified, rising in pitch to a gut-wrenching shriek of tortured metal and stressed concrete. Fidelia's eyes darted to the section of the foundation that had just been poured. She saw it before anyone else. A spiderweb of cracks erupted across the gray surface. The very section where her calculations had been flawless began to buckle, to sag inward. Chaos exploded. Shouts of alarm turned to screams of terror. Men scrambled for safety as the rebar cage twisted and warped with an unholy noise. Fidelia was frozen for a single, paralyzing second. Her mind, her greatest asset, refused to process what her eyes were seeing. This was not possible. Her design could not fail. The thought was a shield against the rising panic, but the shield shattered when she saw a group of workers trapped near the collapsing edge. The architect in her gave way to the commander. "Get back, everybody! Move back!" she screamed, her voice raw. She started forward, pointing, directing, trying to impose order on the pandemonium. In that moment of selfless action, she didn't see the crane above her swaying violently as the ground beneath it shifted. She didn't see the steel support cable snap under the unnatural tension. She only registered a high-pitched whistle, the sound of something immense cutting through the air. She looked up. A colossal steel beam, black against the dusty sky, was tumbling end over end, directly toward her. There was no time for fear, no time for regret. Her last conscious thought was not for her life, but for her creation, a single, horrified, and prideful thought. But the calculations were perfect. Then the world went black, obliterated by a concussive force that felt like the hand of God himself, smashing her monument to the ground. The shriek of twisting metal was the last sound she heard before the echoing void consumed her. The first thing to return was the smell. It was a sharp, sterile scent that scoured the inside of her nostrils antiseptic. The second was the color white, a flat, unforgiving white that coated the ceiling, the walls, the sheets that lay over her. The third was the silence. It wasn't the absence of noise, but a muffled, insulated quiet that felt heavy, unnatural. Fidelia's eyelids fluttered open. A blurry figure resolved itself into a woman with kind, dark eyes and a gentle expression. A name tag on her white coat read, Dr. Anya Sharma. Fidelia, can you hear me? The voice was calm, professional. Fidelia tried to speak, but her throat was a desert. A dry rasp was all that escaped. She tried to sit up, a lifetime of agency and control rushing back, but a network of pain flared through her body, sharp and electric. It was centered in her left leg, a blinding, white-hot agony that made her gasp. Easy, easy, Dr. Sharma said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. You're at Northwestern Memorial. You've been in and out of consciousness for 3 days. You were in an accident. The memories came rushing back in disjointed, terrifying fragments. The groan of the earth, the screaming metal, the black beam against the sky. My design. The words formed in her mind with cold dread. The tower, she managed to whisper. Dr. Sharma's expression was carefully neutral. The construction site has been shut down. There's an investigation. 2 men were killed, Fidelia. Several others were injured. The words didn't register as a human tragedy. They registered as a catastrophic failure. Her failure. The weight of it was more crushing than any physical injury. Over the next few days, the full scope of her new reality was laid out for her with clinical precision. Dr. Sharma explained the injuries. Multiple fractures in her ribs and right arm, all of which would heal. A severe concussion. But the steel beam had not just broken bones in her left leg. It had crushed them, shredding the nerves and muscles around the tibia and fibula. We've performed 3 surgeries to stabilize the leg, Dr. Sharma explained, pointing to an X-ray that looked like a shattered piece of pottery held together with screws and plates. We've done everything we can. The bones will mend, in their way. But the nerve damage, Fidelia, it's permanent. You will walk again, with extensive therapy, but you will have a pronounced limp, and you will live with a degree of chronic pain for the rest of your life. Permanent. The word hung in the sterile air of the room, an eternal sentence. Permanent limp, permanent pain, permanent failure. Elias was there, a constant presence in those first weeks. He held her hand, his face a mask of concern. He brought flowers that wilted in the corner, their cloying scent mixing with the antiseptic. But his conversations were not about her. Not really. They were about the fallout. Our lawyers are handling everything, he'd say, pacing the small room. The preliminary report is blaming the concrete mixture. It's a PR nightmare. He ran a hand through his perfect hair. We need to get our story straight. This is a problem for us. Fidelia, we'll get through it together. But the way he said us felt hollow. It felt like he was talking about the firm, the brand, the name on the letterhead. When he looked at her, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not just concern, but a dawning horror. He was looking at a broken thing, a liability. The brilliant architect was gone, replaced by a crippled woman who was the face of the biggest disaster in recent Chicago construction history. The seeds of his abandonment were sown right there, in the sterile soil of her hospital room. The darkness that began to seep into Fidelia's soul had nothing to do with the painkillers or the long, sleepless nights. It was the chilling realization that everything she had built her life upon her intellect, her body, her career, her relationship was as fragile as the foundation she had designed. She had been the master of her universe. Now, she was a prisoner in a broken body, her name forever synonymous with rubble and death. The echoing void of her unconsciousness had become her new reality. Part 2. A Decade in the Shadow. The gilded cage was on the 52nd floor of a different skyscraper, one with an unobstructed view of the lake. It was a minimalist masterpiece of chrome and white leather, a space her former self would have admired. But for the Fidelia of 2019, 5 years after the accident, it was a prison. The curtains were almost always drawn, casting the sprawling apartment in a perpetual twilight. The place was immaculately tidy, but it had the sterile, untouched quality of a museum exhibit. It was a life preserved in amber, a monument to who she used to be. Fidelia lived off the settlement, a vast, obscene amount of money paid out by the concrete manufacturer, the construction company, and her own insurers. It was blood money, a constant liquid reminder of her failure. It paid for the apartment, for the high-end groceries she had delivered, for the pills that kept the worst of the pain in her leg at a dull roar instead of a scream. Elias was a ghost. He had lasted 2 years. 2 years of her rages, her silences, her bitter refusal to be fixed. He couldn't handle the new Fidelia, the one who was no longer a brilliant asset, but a professional and personal stain. He left with a series of well-rehearsed apologies about needing to move on, about her negativity dragging them both down. He and his dazzling smile had moved on to salvage the Vance name from the wreckage of their shared one. Her days bled into one another in a gray haze. She would wake, swallow her medication, and sit in a designer armchair, replaying the accident in her mind. She would dissect every decision, every calculation, every moment of hubris, searching for the precise point where her perfect world had cracked. The pain in her leg was a physical anchor to that moment, a constant, throbbing metronome counting out the seconds of her wasted life. Her only regular human contact was Dr. Anya Sharma, who had transitioned from her surgeon to her physical therapist, and now, by default, to something resembling a reluctant friend. Anya would arrive twice a week, her practical, no-nonsense energy a stark contrast to the apartment's stagnant air. She would guide Fidelia through painful exercises, her hands firm and professional. "Come on, Fidelia, 10 more reps," Anya would say, her voice brooking no argument. Fidelia would grit her teeth, sweat beading on her forehead as she pushed against the resistance bands, her left leg trembling with the effort. The limp was a part of her now, a flawed rhythm in her walk that announced her brokenness to the world. Today, after the session, Anya didn't pack up her equipment immediately. She sat in the chair opposite Fidelia, her gaze direct. "I saw an exhibition on postmodern architecture is opening at the Art Institute," she said. "I thought you might be interested." "No," Fidelia said, her voice flat. "There's a new coffee shop on the corner. We could just walk down, get out for 10 minutes. "No." Anya sighed, a sound of profound patience mixed with frustration. "Fidelia, it's been 5 years. You have this beautiful apartment, but you live in it like a tomb. Your leg has healed as much as it's going to. The rest of this..." She paused, searching for the right words. "The rest of this is a choice." She tapped her own temple, then her chest. "The real recovery has to happen in here, and in here, and it can't happen if you never leave this room." Fidelia's jaw tightened. A cold, hard bitterness, her constant companion, rose in her throat. "You don't know anything about it, Anya. You see the leg, you don't see the rest. The failure, you can't put a resistance band around that." "No," Anya agreed softly. "I can't. But you can't keep hiding from the world because it hurt you. It's still out there. Life is still out there." Fidelia turned her head and stared at the sliver of gray sky visible between the drawn curtains. Life was out there. That was the problem. It had gone on without her, leaving her behind in the rubble. It was a day when the walls felt closer than usual, the silence of the apartment a screaming accusation. The pain in her leg was a sharp, insistent thing, and the pills weren't touching it, a desperate, primal need to escape, to simply be somewhere else, propelled her into action. She grabbed her keys, her cane, and limped to the elevator, not knowing or caring where she was going. She drove for hours, leaving the dense geometry of Chicago behind for the flat, open plains of rural Illinois. The city skyline shrank in her rear-view mirror until it was gone. She drove aimlessly, following unfamiliar county roads past endless fields of corn and soy. Just as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting a golden glow over the landscape, her car sputtered. A warning light flashed on the dashboard, overheating. With a final, metallic sigh, the engine died. She coasted to the side of a quiet road on the outskirts of a small town. A simple wooden sign read, "Welcome to Havenwood, Pop 2, 412. The tow truck would be an hour." Fidelia got out of the car, leaning heavily on her cane. The air here was different. It smelled of cut grass and damp earth, not exhaust fumes. The silence was different, too. It was filled with the gentle hum of insects and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. She began to walk, her limp more pronounced on the uneven gravel shoulder. Her aimless wandering led her down a quiet main street with a quaint, old-fashioned feel, and then up a slight hill toward a simple, white-steepled church. A low stone wall enclosed the church grounds, and over it spilled a riot of color. Roses, deep reds, vibrant pinks, creamy whites, and sunny yellows, all blooming with an almost defiant vitality. She found herself drawn to them, an unexpected pull toward something so unapologetically alive. She pushed open the simple iron gate and limped inside. An elderly man was on his knees beside one of the rose bushes, his back to her. He wore simple work pants and a faded blue shirt. His hands, covered in thin leather gloves, moved with a slow, patient grace as he snipped away dead blooms. He must have heard the crunch of her footsteps on the gravel path. He looked up, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a pale, clear blue. He saw her, the expensive but rumpled clothes, the state-of-the-art cane, the pain etched deep into the lines around her mouth and eyes. He didn't stare at her leg. He simply looked at her face. He pushed himself up slowly, his joints creaking. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask if she needed help. He simply walked to a small groundskeeper's shed tucked behind the church, emerging a moment later with a glass of water. The glass was old and thick, beaded with condensation. He handed it to her, then gestured with his chin toward a weathered wooden bench under a large oak tree. Fidelia, for reasons she couldn't fathom, took the water and sat down. The coolness of the glass was a comfort in her hand. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the snipping of his shears as he returned to his work. They take their time. "These roses," he said finally, his voice raspy but gentle. He wasn't looking at her, but at the bush he was tending. "They don't much care what we want. They just grow according to their own season. All we can do is give them a little water and sun and be patient." The words were simple, agricultural, but they landed in the barren ground of Fidelia's heart with an unexpected weight. She looked from the man's weathered hands to the vibrant, perfect bloom he had just cleared the way for. Patience, seasons, things she had once steamrolled over in her relentless pursuit of progress. Here, they were just the way of things. She took a sip of the cold water, and for the first time in a very long time, felt a flicker of something other than bitterness. The drive became a ritual, once a week, sometimes twice. Fidelia would escape her Chicago prison and make the long drive to Havenwood. She never planned it. The need would simply arise. A desperate thirst for the quiet and the colors of the garden at St. Jude's Community Church. She would park down the street and limp through the iron gate to the bench under the oak tree. His name was Samuel. He was the groundskeeper. She learned this not because he introduced himself, but because she overheard the pastor call his name one afternoon. He was a man of few words, and their friendship, if it could be called that, developed in the comfortable silences between them. He would be there, tending to his garden, a constant, steady presence. Sometimes he would offer her a ripe tomato from a small vegetable patch behind the church, its skin still warm from the sun. Other times, he would just nod a greeting and go about his work, leaving her to the solitude she craved, but that felt different here. It wasn't the suffocating solitude of her apartment. It was a peaceful solitude, one that felt held and witnessed. He never asked about her leg. He never asked her name or where she came from. He seemed to accept her presence as he accepted the changing seasons of fact of the landscape. His sermons, she began to realize, were preached with pruning shears and a watering can. One crisp autumn afternoon, as he was gently turning over the soil in a dormant flower bed. He spoke. "Soil needs to rest," he said. His gaze on the dark, rich earth goes fallow for a season. You can't force growth all year round. The dormancy, the quiet time, it's necessary. It's what gathers up the strength for what's to come. Another day, he was aggressively pruning a large, overgrown forsythia bush, cutting away thick branches that seemed perfectly healthy to Fidelia. She must have looked alarmed. He paused, wiping his brow with the back of a gloved hand. "Looks harsh, I know," he said, gesturing with the shears. "But if you don't prune, the whole thing gets weak. You have to cut away the old wood, even the parts that look strong, to make way for the new growth. It's the only way it'll bloom proper come spring. It's an act of faith, in a way, trusting that the cutting will lead to life." His simple, earthy wisdom bypassed her formidable intellect and spoke to a deeper wounded part of her. She, who had always believed in relentless progress and forward momentum, was sitting in a garden with a man who was telling her that rest, dormancy, and even cutting away parts of yourself were essential for life. One afternoon, the pain in her leg was particularly bad. The gray Chicago sky had seemed to press down on her all morning, and the drive to Havenwood had been an act of sheer will. She sat on the bench, her face a tight mask of agony, her hands clenched in her lap. Samuel watched her from across the lawn for a long time. He said nothing. He simply put down his rake, wiped his hands on his trousers, and walked to his small, tidy shed. He returned a moment later, holding something in his hands. It was a book, a small Bible, its black leather cover softened and worn smooth with use. The gold lettering on the spine all but faded away. He stopped in front of her and held it out. It was an offering, not a demand. "I'm not a preacher, miss," he said, his voice quiet. "And I'm not one to tell anyone what to believe. But there's a lot of stories in here about suffering and about what comes after. Might be some company for you on the bad days." He placed the worn book on the bench beside her, careful not to touch her. He didn't wait for a response. He simply gave her a small, kind nod and went back to his raking, leaving her alone with the unexpected gift. The Bible lay on the bench, a silent testament from a man of humble faith to a woman whose only faith had been in herself and had been spectacularly broken. Back in the tomb, the curtains were drawn, the air was stale. The city lights of Chicago, once a symbol of her dominion, were now just a cold, indifferent glitter beyond the glass. The worn Bible sat on her polished coffee table, an alien object in the sterile landscape of her apartment. For days, she ignored it. It was a relic from a world she didn't belong to, a world of simple faith and platitudes that had no place in the complex architecture of her despair. What could a book of ancient stories offer her comfort absolution? She scoffed at the thought, but the silence of the apartment was loud, and her own thoughts were a relentless, circling pack of wolves. One evening, driven by a cocktail of boredom, cynicism, and a microscopic flicker of the curiosity she thought had died years ago, she picked it up. The leather was soft and yielding in her hand, worn to the contours of Samuel's grip. She opened it at random. Genesis. In the beginning, she read a few lines and snorted, closing it. A fairy tale, creation myths. She, a woman who dealt in physics and material strength, had no patience for it, but she didn't put it down. She thought about what Samuel had said. Stories in here about suffering, on a whim. She flipped through the thin, crinkled pages, looking for something that matched her mood. Her fingers, accustomed to the crisp feel of blueprints, felt clumsy. She found the table of contents, and her eyes scanned the names. Job. The name was vaguely familiar, a story of inexplicable loss. She turned to it. She started to read, her sharp, analytical mind prepared to deconstruct the text, to find the logical fallacies, but something else happened. She read of a righteous man, Job, who had everything: wealth, family, health, and lost it all in a single day for no reason he could comprehend. She read of his friends who came to comfort him with easy answers and pious platitudes, insisting he must have done something to deserve his fate. Fidelia felt a jolt of recognition so profound, it was like a physical shock. She saw Elias in those friends. With his talk of moving on, she saw the world in their accusations, a world that couldn't abide suffering without a neat and tidy cause. But most of all, she saw herself in Job's raw, furious anguish. He didn't meekly accept his fate. He raged, he questioned, he cursed the day he was born. He demanded an answer from a silent God. Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. For the first time in 10 years, Fidelia felt understood. This wasn't a story offering cheap comfort. It was a story that looked directly into the abyss of her own despair and didn't flinch. She kept reading over the following nights. She found the Psalms, a collection of poems that were by turns desperate, vengeful, grief-stricken, and soaring. They were the raw, unfiltered cries of the human heart, flung toward heaven. They gave a language to the formless agony she had carried alone for so long. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? From the words of my groaning. The words resonated in the echoing void of her soul. The Bible wasn't fixing her. It wasn't giving her answers or patching up her brokenness, but it was sitting with her in the darkness. It was company, just as Samuel had promised. Her formidable intellect, the proud gatekeeper of her heart, was being bypassed. The ancient words were not speaking to her mind. They were speaking to her wounds, and in the deepest, coldest part of her, a tiny, almost imperceptible thaw had begun. The fluorescent lights of the high-end grocery store were aggressively bright, humming with an irritating buzz. The aisles were filled with people going about their Saturday morning errands, their lives full of a mundane purpose that felt like a personal affront to Fidelia. She hated these necessary trips for supplies, hated navigating the cart with her awkward, lurching gait, hated the fleeting glances of pity from strangers. She was in the dairy aisle, staring blankly at a wall of artisanal yogurts, when she heard a voice. Fidelia, is that you? The voice was like a key turning in a lock she had rusted shut years ago. It was smooth, confident, and utterly familiar. She turned slowly, her heart a cold stone in her chest. It was Elias. He looked older, a touch of silver at his temples, but otherwise unchanged. He wore an expensive casual jacket, the picture of relaxed success, and he was not alone. Standing beside him, her hand resting on his arm, was a woman with a kind, pretty face. She was visibly pregnant, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. "Elias," Fidelia said. Her own voice sounded foreign, a rusty hinge. "Wow, it's been a long time," he said, a strained, polite smile fixed on his face. "This is my wife, Chloe. It's so nice to finally meet you," Chloe said, her smile genuine and warm, which was somehow worse than any malice. "Eli's told me so much about you." The air crackled with a decade of unspoken history. The betrayal, the humiliation, the life they were supposed to have, now embodied by this smiling, pregnant woman. Elias's eyes flickered down to her cane, then quickly back to her face. It was the look she dreaded most, pity. The look that said, "Thank God I escaped that. You're looking..." "Well," he said, the lie hanging awkwardly between them. "I'm the same," she replied, her voice flat, offering no warmth, no absolution. The silence stretched, agonizing. Chloe shifted her weight, a picture of vibrant, fertile life. Elias cleared his throat. "Well, we should let you get back to your shopping. It was good to see you." "Fia?" He hadn't called her that in years. The old pet name was a shard of glass in a freshly opened wound. They moved on down the aisle, their cart filled with the makings of a happy life, leaving Fidelia standing alone amidst the yogurts, her knuckles white on the handle of her own cart. The carefully constructed, fragile piece she had begun to find in the Havenwood garden, and the pages of the worn Bible shattered into a million pieces. The encounter ripped open every scar. The injustice of it all, the sheer, screaming unfairness, consumed her. He had walked away from the wreckage, brushed himself off, and built a new life. She was still buried in it. She abandoned her cart, fled the store, and drove back to her apartment. Her vision blurred by tears of rage she hadn't shed in years. She burst through the door of her gilded cage, and the sight of Samuel's Bible on the coffee table filled her with a sudden, violent fury. Company resonance. What a lie! What good were ancient words against the fresh, brutal pain of the present in a spasm of grief and rage? She grabbed the book and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall with a dull, unsatisfying thud, its pages splaying open as it fell to the floor. The progress she thought she had made felt like a delusion. The light she had glimpsed was just a trick of the shadows. The darkness, her oldest and most faithful companion, was back, and this time it felt absolute. Part 3. The dawn of faith. She fled. The city was a cage, the apartment a tomb, and the memory of Elias's pitying face was a ghost in every corner. She drove. Not aimlessly this time, but with a desperate, singular destination. Havenwood, the garden, the bench. It was the only place that wasn't poisoned by her past. She arrived as a storm was rolling in from the west. The sky was a canvas of bruised purple and angry gray, and a low, ominous rumble echoed across the flatlands. The air was thick and heavy, charged with an energy that mirrored the tempest in her soul. She sat on the bench in Samuel's garden, the vibrant colors of the roses looking unnaturally bright against the dark sky. Her purse was on the bench beside her. Inside, nestled between her wallet and keys, was the Bible. After her rage had subsided, a deeper shame had taken its place. She couldn't leave it lying on the floor. She had retrieved it, smoothed its crumpled pages, and put it back in her bag. An apology to Samuel she could never voice. Now, she took it out. It fell open on her lap, the pages ruffled by the rising wind. It was open to the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew. Her eyes fell on a passage, the words leaping out at her as if they were printed in fire. It was the account of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night before his crucifixion. He was in anguish, his soul overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Fidelia read the words of his prayer, a cry of raw, human desperation. "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. This cup." The words struck Fidelia with the force of a physical blow. Her cup, the cup of her failure, her broken body, her chronic pain, her bitterness, her loneliness, her crushing guilt over the men who died. The cup she had been trying to push away, to deny, to ignore for 10 agonizing years. And here it was, in the hands of the Son of God, who was asking, just as she had 1,000,000 times in the silent screams of her heart, if there was any other way. A jagged fork of lightning split the sky, followed an instant later by a deafening crack of thunder. The storm broke. The heavens opened up, and the rain began to fall, not a gentle shower, but a torrential, driving downpour. It soaked her clothes, her hair, plastering it to her face. It blurred the words on the page. But she didn't move. She just sat there in the deluge, the cold rain a pale imitation of the storm raging inside her. All of it the pride that led to the accident, the gnawing question of her culpability, the shame of her crippled body, the bitter hatred for Elias, the deeper, colder hatred for herself. It all culminated in that single, shattering moment, the dam of her long-held control, the fortress of her intellect and will, finally broke. A sound was torn from her throat, a sound she had not made since she was a child, a raw, ragged sob of pure anguish. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a structured plea. It was a complete and utter surrender. She looked up at the churning, violent sky, the rain streaming down her face like tears she no longer had to manufacture. "If you are there," she screamed into the wind and the rain, her voice cracking. "If you can hear me, help me, please. Help me. I can't do this anymore." It was the most honest prayer she had ever uttered. It was the prayer of rock bottom, the moment she finally, truly admitted her own powerlessness. And in the heart of the storm, in the garden of her own Gethsemane, she let the cup, at last, be drenched, broken, and shivering. Fidelia stumbled from the garden. The fury of the storm was at its peak, the wind howling and the rain coming down in blinding sheets. The front doors of the small church were locked, but a side door, the one that led to the small administrative office and sanctuary, was ajar. She pushed it open and fell inside, seeking refuge. The sanctuary of St. Jude's was small and simple, a world away from the grand cathedrals of Europe she had once studied. The only light came from a bank of flickering votive candles near the altar and the periodic, stark flashes of lightning that illuminated the stained glass windows, painting the pews in fleeting, jeweled colors. The roar of the storm was muffled in here, a distant, angry beast. A man was standing near the altar, his back to her. He turned at the sound of the door closing. He was of middling height, with thinning brown hair and a kind, gentle face. Pastor Michael Reeves. She recognized him from a distance, having seen him speak with Samuel on occasion. He saw her state soaked to the bone, her face pale and tear-streaked, her entire body trembling. He didn't rush over. He didn't bombard her with questions or exclamations of alarm. His expression was one of deep, compassionate calm. He simply walked to the first pew, sat down, and patted the spot next to him, an open invitation into the quiet space. For a long moment, Fidelia just stood there, dripping a puddle onto the worn wooden floor. Then, with a shuddering breath, she limped over and sank into the pew beside him. She couldn't look at him. She just stared at the simple wooden cross on the altar. And then she began to talk. The words came out in halting, broken sentences, a torrent of confession held back for a decade. "It was my fault," she whispered, the words tasting like poison. "The accident. I was arrogant. I was so sure. I overrode an engineer. 2 men died because of my pride." She told him everything. She confessed her bitterness toward Elias, the corrosive hatred she had nurtured for years. She confessed the depth of her self-loathing, the way she despised her own broken body, the prison her life had become. She told him about her decade of running, of hiding, of trying to outrun a pain that was fused to her very soul. It wasn't an eloquent speech. It was a messy, raw, and deeply honest unraveling. Pastor Michael didn't interrupt. He didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. He just listened. He listened with an intensity and a stillness that made her feel, for the first time, truly heard. The storm raged outside, a fitting soundtrack to her confession. When she finally fell silent, exhausted and empty, he still waited a moment before speaking. His voice was as calm and gentle as his eyes. "Fidelia," he said, and the sound of her own name spoken with such kindness was almost too much to bear. "Thank you for telling me." He paused, choosing his words with care. Grace is not something we earn by being good. It's not a reward for being strong or having it all together. It's something we receive when we are finally broken enough to accept it. He turned his gaze from her to the altar. God doesn't meet us at the pinnacle of our strength. He meets us in the rubble of our lives. He's not afraid of your anger or your guilt or your brokenness. He's been waiting here for you, in the heart of it, all along. His words weren't an absolution, but an invitation. An invitation to stop fighting, to stop running, to lay down the impossible burden she had carried for so long. Right there, at the foot of that simple, broken altar, in the heart of the storm, a profound quiet began to settle in her soul. Exhaustion, bone deep and absolute, finally claimed her. Fidelia had fallen asleep right there in the pew, curled up like a child, the pastor having quietly draped a blanket from his office over her. She didn't dream. For the first time in 10 years, her sleep was a true void, empty of nightmares and replays of the accident. She woke to a gentle, colored light on her face. The storm had passed. The morning sun was streaming through the stained glass windows of St. Jude's, throwing patterns of sapphire, ruby, and gold across the pews and the floor. The air was clean and fresh, smelling of rain-washed earth and old wood. The silence in the church was no longer heavy or empty, but peaceful and full. She sat up slowly. Her clothes were still damp, her body ached, and the familiar chronic pain in her left leg was there, a dull, low throb. It hadn't magically vanished. The past was still real. The accident had still happened. Elias had still left her. But something fundamental had shifted within her. The crushing weight on her chest, the suffocating presence that had been her constant companion for a decade, was lighter. It wasn't gone, but it was no longer an anvil pressing her into the ground. It felt more like a memory of a weight, an echo rather than the thing itself. She looked around the empty sanctuary. The candles had burned out. In the clean morning light, the place looked humble, even a little worn. It was not a place of grand miracles or supernatural displays. The miracle, she was beginning to understand, had not happened to her body. It had happened somewhere deeper, in the very foundation of her soul. She thought of the rage she had felt in the grocery store, the violent despair that had caused her to throw the Bible against the wall. She could still recall the feeling, but it was as if she were remembering someone else's emotion. The sharp, jagged edges of her bitterness had been worn smooth. The fury had been quenched, not by answers, but by the drenching rain of her own surrender. She didn't feel cured. She felt washed clean. She pushed herself to her feet, her limp a familiar, unchanging rhythm. She walked to the altar and ran her hand over the simple wooden cross. She wasn't filled with a sudden, ecstatic joy. She was filled with a quiet, profound, and utterly foreign sense of peace. It was the peace of acceptance. Acceptance of her brokenness, her past, her pain. It was the peace of finally understanding what Pastor Michael had said, that she didn't have to be perfect to be worthy of grace. She only had to be willing to receive it. This was the resurrection, not of her career, not of her body, but of her spirit. The darkness had been her prison of bitterness and isolation. The light, streaming through the windows, was the dawn of something new: forgiveness, hope, and the quiet, steadying sense of being loved, not in spite of her brokenness, but right in the midst of it. The architect who had tried to build a monument to herself had finally been brought home to a foundation she had not built, a foundation that could not be shaken. Part 4. Building a new foundation. 3 years later, in the autumn of 2027, the community hall of St. Jude's Church was bustling with people. The air buzzed with conversation and the smell of coffee and baked goods. Fidelia stood at the front of the room, next to an easel holding a large set of blueprints. She was a permanent resident of Havenwood now, her life in the Chicago high-rise a distant memory. Her limp was still with her, a constant physical reminder of her journey. She no longer tried to hide it or felt the sting of shame when people noticed. It was simply a part of her. Like the silver streaks that had begun to appear in her dark hair, it was a testament, not a weakness. She was an integral part of the St. Jude's community, a quiet, thoughtful presence who organized the church library and helped Samuel in the garden when her leg allowed. But tonight, she was an architect again. "As many of you know," she began, her voice steady and clear, carrying easily through the hall, "our community has grown, and so have its needs. Pastor Michael and the church council have been dreaming for years of a way to better serve our neighbors who are struggling." She turned and unveiled the blueprints. A collective gasp of admiration went through the room. It was a design for a new wing for the church. It was beautiful, but its beauty was in its humility and function. The lines were clean, modern, yet warm, designed to blend seamlessly with the old church. Large windows were everywhere, designed to let in as much natural light as possible. It was not a monument, it was a shelter. "This new wing," she explained, pointing with a ruler to different sections of the design, "will house a 12-bed homeless shelter, 6 for men, 6 for women and children. This section here will be a modern, commercial-grade kitchen and a dining hall that will function as a community soup kitchen, serving a hot meal every evening. And this space," she pointed to a bright, airy room overlooking the garden, "will be a free counseling and resource center." Her design was the polar opposite of the Vance Fidelia Tower. That had been a monument to ego, designed to scrape the sky and broadcast her own brilliance. This was a structure designed to serve the lowest, to offer warmth and light to those in the dark. Every choice, from the durable, low-cost materials to the wheelchair-accessible ramps, was made with compassion and practicality in mind. She had used her immense talent not for fame or fortune, but for service. In the back of the hall, Samuel, older now and moving a little more slowly, watched her with a proud, happy smile that crinkled his entire face. He saw not the broken woman who had first stumbled into his garden, but the whole one who had found her true calling in the rubble of her former life. She was rebuilding, but this time on a foundation of faith and love, a foundation that would hold. The dedication day for the new wing of St. Jude's was bright and sunny, one of those perfect, crisp autumn days that felt like a gift. The entire community of Havenwood, it seemed, was gathered on the lawn in front of the new building. The scent of Samuel's late-blooming roses mingled with the joyful chatter of the crowd. The building was even more beautiful in reality than it had been on paper. The glass and wood seemed to capture the sunlight, creating a space that felt both holy and welcoming. Pastor Michael led a prayer of thanks, his voice thick with emotion, as he dedicated the building to the service of God and the community. As the crowd began to move toward the entrance for a tour, Fidelia remained behind, taking it all in. A quiet joy, solid and real, filled her. This was her masterpiece. She saw him then, standing awkwardly at the edge of the crowd. Elias. He looked older, more subdued. The dazzling confidence had been replaced by a quiet hesitancy. He saw her looking and started toward her. Pastor Michael, in an act of profound and perhaps risky grace, had reached out and invited him. He stopped a few feet from her, his hands in the pockets of his expensive coat. For the first time, there was no pity in his eyes. There was only a look of genuine, uncomprehending awe. "Fidelia," he said, his voice quiet, "it's incredible. What you've done here, we've done here." She corrected him gently. This was the work of many hands. He shook his head slightly. "No, this was you. I came to say I'm sorry. For everything. For how I left. For my cowardice. There's no excuse. I was a fool." The apology was simple, unadorned, and for the first time, utterly sincere. Fidelia looked at the man she had once loved and then hated with such passion, and she felt nothing. No bitterness, no anger, no lingering pain, just a calm, quiet peace. "I forgave you a long time ago, Elias," she said, and she knew it was the truth, "and I forgave myself. That was the harder part." She offered him a small, genuine smile. "I had to lose everything I thought I wanted to find everything I truly needed." He nodded, seeming to understand on some level, though the full depth of her transformation was clearly beyond his grasp. He wished her well and quietly slipped away. A ghost from a past life finally laid to rest. The story ended there, in the sunlight. Fidelia went to find Samuel, who was sitting on their old bench, watching families and children explore the new wing. She sat beside him, the comfortable silence stretching between them as it always had. Inside the new dining hall, volunteers were already beginning to set up for the first evening meal. Light poured from the large windows, filling the space. Fidelia's leg ached, a familiar, low hum beneath the surface of her peace. The pain was still a reality, but it was just background noise now. Her focus was on the light, both the literal light filling the building she had designed, and the metaphorical light that now filled her life. She was a living testimony. Her life no longer a monument to her own greatness, but to a grace that could find anyone, even in the deepest darkness, and build something beautiful from the rubble.